Let's do this. Chapter 1, Industrial and Organizational Psychology, the Profession and its History. In this chapter, we'll learn the basics of what industrial organizational psychology is and where it came from. Let's start by talking about what it is. Industrial organizational psychology, which I'm going to call IO psychology for the rest of the semester, is also called the psychology of work because it's the specialization of psychology that actually focuses on understanding people in the workplace. To be an IO psychologist, like most psychologists, you need a graduate degree. IO psychologists study all sorts of different issues in the workplace. They study how to best find a good fit between a person and a job through hiring procedures. They study how to train and how to evaluate employees, as well as what motivates people at work, what makes them happy, and how can they have a good work-life balance. IO psychology also studies what employers can do to keep their workers healthy, productive, and satisfied. IO psychology is very interesting because it really focuses on both the employer and the employee. Let's break it down a little bit and look at the difference between industrial psychology and organizational psychology. Although you'll never see these two things separate, it's important to understand what they both mean. Industrial psychology focuses on human resource and is guided by psychological principles. They really focus more on the employer, the organization, the human resource side of things. They work on job analysis, personnel selection, performance appraisal, seeing how good the person is doing at their job, and training procedures. Moving on to the blue side, organizational psychology focuses more on the worker, on the human side of the worker. Organizational psychology studies work motivation, leadership in teams, job satisfaction, and work-life balance. They always go together, but it's important to understand the distinction. Industrial psychology is focused on the industry, on the employer, the organization. And organizational psychology is focused on the worker, the employee, their human side, more of a psychology than a human resource. So what do IO psychologists do? It's really important to understand that IO psychology aims to benefit both the organization and the worker. IO psychologists are on both sides. They're on the side of the employer and the employee. They're interested in helping organizations to find the right workers and put them in the right position. This would result in greater productivity and longer employment. In addition, many IO psychologists work to improve employees' work lives, including more positive job attitudes and even their health. Like all parts of psychology, IO psychology really relies on science. IO psychologists use scientific principles to analyze and answer questions related to worker health, well-being, and worker effectiveness. A lot of large organizations employ IO psychologists. FBI and NASA, Google, Amazon, Nestle, and Starbucks, as well as public government employers, the military, and even non-for-profit and small organizations around the world. They all apply IO psychology principles when they design their employee selection, their employee training, and even promotion programs. They also consult IO psychology to make sure their employees are safe and engaged and not stressed at work. We don't need to read this whole slide, but you can if you want to. Feel free to pause and read it. It explains what the SIOP is. The SIOP stands for the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. It's really important, and you can go to siop.org to take a look around their website. We'll be using their website for our term paper, so it's important to get acquainted with it. The SIOP is the society that really supports IO psychologists. They publish IO psychology research in their 2 academic journals. They host annual conferences for IO psychologists, and their website has a lot of really good information that IO psychologists use or have created. It's really the primary organization for IO psychologists in North America. As you can see by the pie chart, a lot of its members are students. Let's discuss for a moment the scientist practitioner model. It really is at the base or the foundation of IO psychology. An IO psychologist, it's imperative, they have to be both a scientist and a practitioner. A scientist who does research and a practitioner who's out there in the workplace, in the field, doing the work. In a medical field, we have scientists who stay in the lab and we have doctors who stay in the office. But in IO psychology, they're often the same people. And when they're not the same people, they work together, hand in hand, back and forth all the time. The scientist practitioner model makes sure that IO psychologists consider strong theories that have been rigorously tested with strong research, and also consider the applicability of this research to their work organizations. No IO psychologist does their research in a vacuum. They're making sure that their research is applicable in the organizations where the IO psychologists are working. The scientist practitioner model also challenges IO psychologists to be sure that they make practice recommendations based on strong research findings. So the research is based on their work in the field, and their work in the field is based on their research. At the bottom it says, IO psychologists need to understand how to do good research and the challenges of applying research to the workplace. So basically the scientist practitioner model tells us that all IO psychologists are concerned with the science behind it and the applicability of the field. So where do IO psychologists work? I use this from the textbook. I wish the colors matched up. They don't really. But as you can see in the pie chart, the majority of IO psychologists actually work in the academic field. But we have a lot who are in consulting, private industry, and even working in government or other organizations. The military hires IO psychologists, as we'll discuss in a moment. Soon we'll talk about IO psychology and how it related to its impact to both world wars. Which brings us to our history. We're going to discuss the history of IO psychology in terms of the different important eras. But before we start, we're going to talk about the important figures in history. We can trace IO psychology all the way back to Germany, to Wilhelm Wundt's lab. And Wundt actually trained 3 Americans, Munsterberg, Cattell, and Scott, who all came back to America from Germany and really started the field of IO psychology. They trained under him in Germany, but then they came back here and really got things started. Munsterberg and Cattell trained for many years under Wundt, and then came back to America, where they started some of the very earliest work in the field of IO psychology. Soon after that, Walter Dill Scott, who also trained under Wundt, returned to the US, worked at Northwestern, and became famous for a lot of essays that he published regarding the application of psychology to industrial settings. As you can see, this really was the start of industrial organizational psychology. We'll talk about World War I for a little bit, and then I will introduce you to the father of industrial organizational psychology. When the US entered World War I, they had to quickly deal with over 1 million recruits. They weren't sure how to process and place them, how to divide them up. So Walter Dill Scott and another psychologist, Walter Bingham, helped with the selection and placement of the personnel. They did this by adapting an existing test, the Stanford-Binet. It's basically an IQ test. They adapted it to a format that could be used to test a large number of people at once. This was very helpful to the military. They also created 2 versions of the test: the Army Alpha, the version for recruits who could read, and the Army Beta for recruits who could not read. The two tests helped to promote the use of testing in personnel selection. So these two tests, Army Alpha and Army Beta, were the very first test used in America for personnel selection. It really kind of paved the way for IO psychology to take hold. As we delve into the history of IO psychology, it's important that we talk about the important eras. Some of the eras overlap. IO psychology really started with scientific management. In a moment, we'll discuss what scientific management means, as well as Frederick Taylor, the father of IO psychology. After that, human relations era took over when we started to focus more on the human side of work. World War II also employed IO psychologists. We'll get to that soon. Then the civil rights era changed things for for all organizations. And the high-tech HR era is changing things even faster than research can keep up. We'll go through these eras one at a time, and then the chapter is done. Scientific management, which we say goes from about 1905 to 1920, it was really meant to use the logical scientific principles in the management of organization. It was the first time that this was done. So management was done scientifically, thus the name scientific management. Frederick Taylor, who's known as the father of IO psychology, was the one who proposed a break from the simple common sense approach to management. He proposed that we use science to actually find the best man for the job and the best way for doing the job. Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, husband and wife, who happened to have 12 children, were some of the first to apply the then new technology of motion pictures, and they did time motion studies. They used these motion pictures to help them figure out the most efficient ways to do work by eliminating the unnecessary steps or motions. And Lillian Gilbreth is actually cited as the first person to receive a PhD in industrial psychology. She graduated from Brown University in 1915. So two very important people on this slide: Frederick Taylor, the father of IO psychology, and Lillian Gilbreth, the first recipient of an IO psychology degree. The next era we'll discuss is the human relations era. This one also led us to discover a very important principle called the Hawthorne effect. The human relations movement focused on the importance of workers' feelings and attitudes on their performance. This all started when they did a study at Hawthorne Works, which is an electric company in Illinois. The researchers were trying to study the effects of workplace lighting on the productivity. They probably thought that workers with better lighting would produce more or have better productivity. However, they found that regardless of the conditions, all workers' productivity increased when they were being watched. This led them to coin the name Hawthorne effect, since they found it out at the Hawthorne Electric Company. The Hawthorne effect is defined as a situation where research participants behave in certain ways because they know they are in a study. Basically, you act differently when you know you're being watched. These studies led the field towards focusing on workers' attitudes. World War II was another chance for IO psychology to have a big input in our society, and they helped the military 3 different ways. Again with selection, just like World War I, but this time they used biographical data for the first time to figure out placement of the recruits. They also helped with training. And finally, they helped with standardizing cockpits. When all the cockpits of the airplanes were the same, they avoided retraining when pilots would switch planes. After this came the Civil Rights era. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed, and in terms of organizational psychology, this really challenged the organizations because they had to ensure that their selection procedures were not only fair, but fair enough that they could be defensible in court. As an employer, you had to make sure that your selection procedures, should they be challenged in court, were truly fair. And finally, we enter the high-tech HR era, which started around 2000 and is still going now. During this era, we found that new technology actually develops more quickly than the research does. So we're not sure which technological developments are helpful and which ones may be providing us with incorrect information. Some of the big changes we noticed around the year 2000 were that while people used to submit resumes or applications on paper, now it was being done electronically. Also, testing used to be done in person and take a long time for results. Now you can do it automatically online. And also, training used to happen in small groups in person. Now you can be trained online with videos. A lot has changed during this era, and a lot will continue to change. What's really challenging is that those changes happen faster than the research can keep up. Now that we've discussed the important eras in history, we'll talk about a few current challenges that IO psychology has, and then we'll do a quick review before we're done. Big data means lots of data coming from an organization or a group without looking at the individual data per person. So when you look at big data, we're not looking at each person's information, we're looking at the sum of all the information. What does it tell us all together? It's really useful and allows for a big range of performance measures. Lots of employee information can be gathered as a whole, and it can even predict what type of employees might be the best to hire in the future. The only real downside of big data is the privacy aspect. Although we don't look at each person's data individually, each person's individual data is in there. So there can definitely be ethical and legal considerations when we're talking about your employer essentially selling your data. One more important thing to talk about is globalization and its effect on IO psychology. Globalization basically means multinational organizations, different organizations in different countries working together. As travel and technology and communication is increasing, a lot of companies are functioning in more than one country. But this creates a lot of challenges for IO psychology. In most of the history of IO psychology, their psychologists were trained just to work in one country or in one culture. But because of the rise in multinational organizations, we now need to be prepared to work across a wide range of different countries and cultures. And there's lots of different norms and different expectations in these different cultures. Let's discuss a few current challenges. At the top, we talk about changes in the nature of work, automation of work, increased need for technical support, telework. The nature of work is changing. Like we said, in this technological era, it's changing faster than the research can keep up. It's really hard for IO psychologists to always be up to date with the newest changes. Diversity management is also really important, especially with globalization, like we just talked about. It's important to value diversity and inclusion by creating an environment where people from different backgrounds can feel safe. In the purple, we talk about the aging workforce and age-diverse workforce. People are now working way past retirement age, which means we have younger workers and older workers working side by side, which presents another challenge for IO psychologists. Humanitarian work psychology actually uses organizational psychology to improve the welfare of people in low-income nations and wealthy ones. But before, we only focused our research on the wealthy nations. Now we focus on how we can use IO psychology to help organizations and workers in third world or low-income countries. Finally, occupational health psychology is the part of IO psychology that focuses on keeping workers safe, happy, and healthy, reducing their stress, and improving their work-life balance. All right, that's it for the chapter. Let's review chapter 1 real quick, and you can always rewatch the video if you like. Starting on the left-hand side, we remind ourselves that industrial psychology, the I part of IO, focuses on the employer and human resources. The O part, organizational psychology, focuses on the worker, their satisfaction, health, etc. So remember, IO psychologists focus on both the worker and the organization. The SIOP, Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, is an organization that supports IO psychologists. They publish 2 academic journals and host annual conferences. Very important to IO psychology is the science practitioner model, which makes sure that we include research in practice and practice in research. We also learned that most IO psychologists work in academia or private industry. On the right-hand side, we'll talk about the history real quick. IO psychology first started in Wilhelm Wundt's lab in Germany, where he trained Americans Hugo Munsterberg, James McKean Cattell, and Walter Dill Scott. They came back to the US and really got IO psychology started over here. However, Frederick Taylor is considered the father of IO psychology. He started scientific management, which focused on finding the best man for the job and the best way to do the job, not just going with whatever worked or whatever you thought of first. Lillian Gilbreth was the first person to receive an IO degree in 1915 from Brown University. Now we'll talk about the eras of history real quick. During World War I, IO psychology developed Army Alpha and Army Beta to use as selection tools. Then the human relations era focused on the workers' attitudes. During that era, we learned about the Hawthorne effect, which tells us that people behave differently when they're being observed. During World War II, the IO psychologists helped with 3 things. They helped the military with training, selection, and standardizing the cockpits of airplanes. The Civil Rights Act, which was signed in 1964, required employers to provide fair selection procedures, fair enough that they could stand up in court. And finally, in our current high-tech era, the technology is changing faster than IO psychology can keep up. That's it for Chapter 1. Feel free to rewatch the video. Make sure you read the chapter in the book, and you can go ahead and take the quiz when you're ready.